Okay, last week talking about this food nutrition safety and price tripod. And we've had some really great conversations. I think Miss Maddie, you've maybe been in on every single week of these conversations. And I know Miss Bridget has been party to some of these. So, what we're going to do is kind of replay what we did in the text chat this week. That seemed to go over pretty well. So, kind of pop quiz style, again, making this interactive, thinking through if you were in the grocery store and you had these two options, two different ground beef options to buy, how would you think through which one to buy? And we're going to consider each of our three factors. We're going to consider our nutrition, we're going to consider safety, and we're going to consider price. So that makes sense?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm glad you guys are ready. So right now we have two different options for ground beef. Just right off the bat, you can see that one costs $6.49 per pound. The other costs $7.99 per pound. One is maybe what you would find at the deli, right? Like at the butcher section. And Miss Maddie and Miss Bridget, I think you both are calling from Chicago. So great. All three of us are from Chicago. These prices and these uh, samples were actually taken from Jewel Osco's website. So all
Okay.
of us have access to these particular items here. And I think we just got one more person in. So hi, Idalia, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, good. Thanks for joining. Really excited to have you. So, Miss Maddie and Miss Bridget and I were just starting to talk about how to distinguish between two different types of ground beef. And so this is a really intimate setup, by the way, so no pressure to turn your video on. But if you'd like to listen along and interject whenever you feel like it with a question or, an observation, go ahead. So we're going to play out a conversation that we've been having in the group text chat and choose between these two types of ground beef. We've been using this framework to think through uh, how to balance nutrition and safety and price in our grocery shopping so that we get the sorts of nutritious benefits that we need to prevent chronic diseases, but we also take into account the safety aspects um, of food. So we'll talk in a second about what exactly that means, right? And then we take into account price. And it's important, we keep coming back to this framework, Miss Maddie and Miss Bridget, because in many of these cases, these grocery decisions are completely subjective, right? Um, I can't necessarily tell you, aside from nutrition and some of the safety criteria, I can't tell you exactly what to buy or what the right grocery choices are for you. You've got to weigh your priorities. So, this is an opportunity to do that. And we were just comparing the prices of these two ground beef options. So we know that one is more expensive, $7.99 compared to $6.49. And we're going to just go through and take a look at this more expensive item, mainly because it has labels on its front. And so uh, we'll take a look, read the labels, sort of skim through, pay attention to specifically which safety labels you see. And remember, we talked before about how safety labels are referring to hormones. So it may say hormone free or no added hormones. We think about safety in terms of antibiotics, another chemical that can be added to animal products, which may influence the safety of the food. So you can look for antibiotic free. And then organic, we talked about that as sort of a catch-all term that means no hormones and no antibiotics were used in the creation of this food. So you got can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Good, good, good. I'm just going to blow this up here. You've got your image, and if you just call out, which safety labels do you see?
85% lean, 15%.
Okay, I love that. I love that initiative. So 85% lean ends up being really important, but interestingly, that counts as a nutrition label, right? Because that tells us about the nutrient content of the food. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Keep that 85% lean in mind. But I'm thinking about, do you see anything that says hormones on it?
Yes. No added hormones.
Exactly. So no added hormones, essentially hormone free, that label, okay? And then do we see anything that mentions antibiotics at all?
Yes. It says without antibiotics.
Exactly. So antibiotic free. So those are two chemical exposures that these cows did not have in the creation of this beef, right? Farmers did not add antibiotics or hormones. Okay. And then the third option we had here is, do we see an organic label anywhere on the front of this package?
No, I do not see an organic label.
No, no, agreed. You know, there's this circle down here. When we did this via text message, some people answered that they saw organic. And I think what might have fooled them is this kind of illegible circle in the bottom right-hand corner. But that actually just says that it's been inspected by the USDA, but not that it's organic. So the interesting thing is, we've talked about how organic essentially means no antibiotics and no hormones when we're talking about animal products. So we could, right? This maybe could have the organic label. This is the type of product that would be called organic, but no, we don't see the official organic seal. So we can't call it that. All right. So which safety labels did we find? Basically A and B, right?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Um, Now just taking a few steps back, you remember we've talked about this in previous weeks, especially related to plant exposures and plant safety. But you know, the sorts of safety labels that you can find on food products might include specific chemical exposures. So we talked about that. For animals, it's basically, have these animals been exposed to hormones? Have they been exposed to antibiotics, either you know, for prevention or for treatment of an infection? And so the labels you'll see would be hormone free, or in this case, no added hormones, antibiotics free, or in this case, beef raised without antibiotics. So worded a bit differently, but it means the same. And then for produce, right, for our fruits and veggies and grains, you might see a label that says either pesticide free or non-GMO. And this is a couple weeks back, but do any of you remember what GMO stands for?
Genetically modified organism.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you. Good call, Ms. Bridget. So exactly, non-genetically modified organism. Um, and so the last two, pesticides and GMOs, refer to produce, plants, and the first two, refer to animals and meat and their byproducts. And then we've got organic, which again is sort of the catch-all term that says it doesn't have any of those, not any of those four exposures were included in raising this plant or animal that we're now going to eat. So that's really important to know. And I'll tell you, you know, we include these four exposures in safety category because there is a varying level of scientific understanding of the safety of these compounds. So we talked about this just last week, Miss Maddie. So I don't know if you remember, we talked about how antibiotics, when they're added to developing animals, so antibiotics are really commonly used actually in poultry, in cows, in order to prevent infection and increase growth. And so the World Health Organization warns us that overusing antibiotics in this way, right, using them for prevention, can increase the number of superbugs. So bacteria growing in and around these animals that are actually resistant to the antibiotics because they've been exposed too much. So the question around whether or not we should have antibiotic-free food is really less of a question of whether the antibiotics that these animals ingest, whether they end up in the food and whether we eat them. The question is really more how the bacteria that these animals may be infected by or that may live in their gut or just on their skin, how the bacteria mutate into these superbugs that can infect humans and which we don't have a really, or we won't have a great treatment for once the bugs have mutated. And so the World Health Organization, it's really actually a little bit odd for the World Health Organization to weigh in on these agricultural issues, but the body of research swung so heavily towards the potential to cause harm in human populations that they thought they needed to release a statement, which is what they did. So that's the safety issue with antibiotics, and it can be kind of a complicated one. So I want to stop here and just see if folks have questions about that. No?
So is it,
Oh.
so the non-GMO, sometimes I know with farm-raised fish, they've had questions about increased antibiotics, especially in catfish, because they try to grow them quickly under maybe not the best conditions. And I kind of remember like an NPR talk about it, or news about it, some information about it, maybe 3 years ago. And I don't remember seeing labels on my fish.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question because that's not something that we've addressed over these past few weeks. But that's really where the push to buy wild caught fish comes from. So, you mentioned catfish. Salmon is another place where, or another type of fish where we see large amounts of farming, particularly in Chile. So you may have heard of the Chilean salmon farms. Those got a lot of press over the last few years. And that's where we end up seeing increased use of antibiotics, just like you said, to promote growth and prevent infection. So that's where seeing the label on the fish, or label in the fish section, if you're buying it from a deli, the label would say wild caught. So like wild Alaskan caught, for example, and not farmed. But you're right, we otherwise don't see a no antibiotics label on our fish. And I'm not sure why that is. I'll look into that. There may be a sort of FDA or USDA loophole where labeling rules are a bit different for fish than for cows and poultry and these sort of land animals. But presumably, buying wild caught fish as opposed to farmed fish will significantly reduce the chances that your fish will have been exposed to antibiotics. Does that answer your question, Ms. Bridget?
Yes, thank you. That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, okay. Let's see. So I'll move on to hormones, right? And we've talked before about how the scientific literature, the research studies, are not really clear on the potential harms of hormone use, right? The FDA has approved hormone use in cows that don't produce dairy. And it has prohibited hormone use in dairy cows, in veal producing animals, in all poultry. And so that means, right, no steroid hormone runoff in eggs. There is one sort of caveat, which is all those animals I just mentioned, where the FDA's prohibited hormone use, they prohibited steroid hormones. So the main hormones you think about that are estradiol, which is like human estrogen, but the animal's natural estradiol. There is testosterone, and there is pregnenolone, which is like human progesterone. And then there are the artificial versions of those steroid or sex hormones. But there is, so none of those are allowed to be used in dairy cows, veal producing animals. I don't think I mentioned pork earlier, but pork is also prohibited in pork, and poultry. However, the FDA does allow the use of this artificial growth hormone in cows of all sorts, including dairy producing cows. So we're talking about beef today. It's really important, right, to think through the hormone use in beef, because while beef may not have been exposed to those steroid or sex hormones that I just mentioned, like those six, they are pretty much across the board exposed to this artificial growth hormone, which you may have heard of. The acronym is RBST, or recombinant bovine somatostatin, somatostatin being just the word for growth hormone. And the literature on the harms of eating meat or drinking milk, eating dairy products that have been exposed to RBST is actually pretty significant. So we don't have long-term studies that have been conducted, right? But the American Public Health Association, the American Society of Endocrinology, over a decade ago, published statements against the use of RBST because RBST exposed cows have been found to have increased levels of this other type of hormone, insulin-like growth factor 1. We found increased levels of that hormone in their milk, right? And so that means also in cheese, in other dairy products. Insulin-like growth factor 1 has been associated with increased rates of colon cancer at the population level. It's also been associated with just increased weight gain. It is a sort of growth hormone, and it's one that humans have, and it's one that needs to be regulated properly. So the European Union prohibits the use of this artificial growth hormone, this RBST, in cows. The FDA and the USDA do allow it. But again, based on the lack of long-term studies showing absolutely no harm, and based on the burden of evidence suggesting that insulin-like growth factor 1 actually has been associated with harm outside of this setting, the American Public Health Association says just don't, it shouldn't be used. So when you're making up your mind about whether to get RBST free or hormone free beef, cow milk, cheese, just sort of keep that in mind. The science is not clear either way, but there's enough potential for harm that multiple national organizations have spoken out against this chemical being used until the studies can be done. So that's a mouthful. Did you guys get all that about RBST and hormones in beef?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have any questions? Because Miss Maddie, you followed along throughout these last few weeks, but this bit of information, I don't think this is something that we've covered before. No questions, really?
You know what? One question, I guess. So I have never heard of these RBSTs, never.
Yeah.
And since it's and even these insulin growth hormones, how does that, I'm not sure if I missed that, if you said it or not. How does that change our propensity for diabetes, or how does that affect our diabetic receptor, our insulin receptors? Because, you know, people have insulin resistance or insulin resistant diabetes. Will this exposure somehow downregulate or change our insulin receptors, making us more susceptible to diabetes?
Yeah. So that's a really great question. So insulin-like growth factor 1 is something you might think of as sort of a downstream growth hormone. So increases in insulin-like growth factor 1 or IGF-1 are associated with increased levels of obesity, increased levels of weight gain. And so in that sense, yes, increased levels of IGF-1 may be indirectly associated with, or may indirectly cause increased risk of type 2 diabetes. Because we know that increased weight gain, increased risk of type 2 diabetes. I can't answer the question about whether insulin-like growth factor 1, right? Because it has insulin in the name, you think that it does something with insulin. I can't answer the question of whether it upregulates or downregulates certain glucose receptors that are insulin gated, or whether it directly affects our blood sugar. But we do know that when we put on extra weight, that our bodies are not built for, especially peripheral fat, sort of, you know, around the stomach, on the hips. We have a harder time regulating our blood sugar, and our risk of type 2 diabetes increases. So yeah, I mean, you ask a really good question, Miss Bridget. The more I've read about the potential harm of the downstream effects of increased levels of IGF-1 in milk, the more I've kind of questioned why it's why this is a scenario that we'd allow in our food system. And I've become a lot more conscious about looking for dairy products that are non-RBST. I kind of stopped buying cow's milk a long time ago, but I still eat dairy products. I still eat cheese. And so I look for that non-RBST label. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Thank
But
you.
again, I'm sorry I cut you off there.
I'm sorry. I think that answers my question.
Okay. Okay, cool. All right. I'm gonna skip over pesticides and non-GMO because that's something that we talked about a couple weeks ago. You guys have gotten plenty of texts about that. You also got this image texted to you probably about a week ago, just sort of summarizing the sorts of chemical exposures that our food might have had. And so we're thinking about both produce, plant foods up here on the left, that may be exposed to artificial pesticides. And the reality is because we just don't have high quality studies, we don't have long-term epidemiological studies that will tell us whether or not pesticides cause disease in humans. We kind of are left to weigh the safety on our own. There have been, like I said before, associations with increased consumption of conventional produce or non-organic produce and increased risk of certain health conditions like infertility for men and reduced live births, live births and pregnancy rate for women. But without the right sort of study design, it's really hard to draw a causal link and say that the increased pesticide content of food might have caused those outcomes. So we just really don't know, right? It's kind of up to your own discretion until the science catches up. But then on the hormone side, on the animal side rather, we just talked about how hormones and antimicrobials, there's enough reason for us to just be really cautious. The antibiotics we just talked about in depth, and then the hormones we talked about RBST. But one of the reasons why the World Health Organization spoke out against the use of added hormones in general, not just RBST, is that we also, as science and medicine has understood for some time now, that giving people hormones, we call them exogenous hormones, right? But adding hormones to the existing balance folks have in their bodies can be really harmful, and can change, our disease risks, ranging from cancer to autoimmune disease. And we don't really understand that balance very well. So the thought, again, coming from the American Public Health Association and the Association of Endocrinology, is why risk exposing ourselves to added hormones anywhere, right? Especially in our food supply. Okay. So these are kind of the three chemicals to think about when you're thinking about food safety. Now, we usually go to about 6:45 and we often run over a little bit. So I'm going to speed through this nutrition piece because, Miss Bridget, you were ahead of the game. In the first pop quiz on safety, you called out this 85% lean label. And you were dead on in pointing out how important that is. But it turns out it's more of a nutrition label than anything else, right? So I'm going to blow up this picture and ask you just to call out which labels you see that are related to the nutrition of this ground beef. What do you guys see? We already said 85% lean, 15% fat. That's great. What else we got? This is a little trickier. And some of the language is small. So I'm going to tell you, grass-fed, that can actually affect the nutrition of animals that produce food. And then we've got this tiny little text down here. You might not even be able to see it so well over video, but the very bottom, it says no artificial ingredients. And then it says minimally processed. And then up top in slightly bigger language, it says 100% natural. And so those are all important nutrition labels. And that's just a bigger picture for you there. And the reason is, so I'm going to start with the grass-fed label. So what actually, let's ask you guys, because this is something that we kind of talked about over the last few weeks. Can anybody tell me why cows being grass-fed might be important for their nutrition? Why would it affect their nutrition at all? And if you're not sure, that's okay too. All right, I'm gonna get in there. So it's really not obvious. But when you hear this explanation, you won't be surprised, right? You know how we talk about plant-based diets for humans are actually healthier than eating a bunch of meat or eating a bunch of starches and carbs? If you were to eat like salads, primarily leafy green veggies, as half of your plate, as the USDA recommends, as opposed to eating higher starch foods, you'd probably have lower levels of fat on your body. You might have higher levels of healthier fats. And you just might have higher levels of other nutrients like potassium and vitamin E, which you end up finding in these, especially in these non-starchy veggies. So same goes for cows, for example. When they, oh, good, we've got a raised hand. Miss Adalia, what can we help you with? Got a question? I think you might be muted.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
I think this is really great information that you're sharing with us. But, you know, one of the things that I wanted to add is just like, you know, as we're trying to improve our diets, especially in the African American community, one of the things that I've realized is it's very expensive, you know, to eat healthy, to eat organic, to eat green vegetables. And some people just honestly can't afford to do so, sadly. And, you know, I'm not trying to derail from, you know, the information that you're providing, which is excellent, but it's just also like, you know, there are some people who know how to eat healthy, but they just unfortunately can't afford it. And so, you know, they're making unhealthy choices just to have a meal. And, you know, the McDonald's is 99 cents, you know, if you want to get a small fry or a McChicken, and the salad is like almost $4 or $5. And, you know, you're talking about Black people in America as a whole, economically, we are disadvantaged. And, you know, there's just an overwhelming amount of Black single mothers trying to feed their children, you know, where it's like they're trying to make a decision between paying rent and, you know, buying inorganic, GMO, antibiotic food. You know, this meat is $2.99 a pound. from Safeway or whatever grocery store versus the organic meat from Whole Foods, which is $7.99 a pound, you know, and we kind of make those choices in the short run to the detriment of our health in the long run. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm so glad that you brought that up because that's why price is the third corner of our decision-making tripod. There's nutrition, there's safety, and then there's price. And we have to decide how to find the best balance of nutrition, safety, and price so that we can eat a high quality diet. Now, you mentioned something that I hear all the time, and I just want to amplify that a little bit. This idea that eating healthily, right, eating leafy greens is expensive. It turns out that if you have access to, and Black communities don't always have access to, a supermarket, if you can get even non organic, giant head of lettuce or giant bunch of spinach, not packaged and already created, you know, in tapped into a salad and pre-washed, you know, and wrapped in plastic like at Trader Joe's. But this is what I buy all the time because it's so much cheaper. It's like 50% less expensive. You can find the other day, I got 5 giant bunches of kale for $1.99. And those 5 bunches of kale lasted me for 3 weeks over the course of a bunch of different meals. I ended up freezing them. And so that's $1.99 that I spent for food that can last multiple meals, multiple weeks. And that kale alone doesn't make up a meal, but you can supplement that if you're making a salad at home with carrots, with radishes. Again, not buying the carrots that are in plastic, not buying baby carrots because those are always more expensive, but the kinds that you have to wash at home and then cut up. So, I mean, you're absolutely right that there is there is this really unfair balance that Black communities in particular, and Black women especially, have to strike between finding things they can afford, finding the most appropriately priced food, and then finding the time, right? Because that's the food that actually takes more time to prepare, finding the time to wash the greens themselves and cut them up and put them into separate bags and decide which to put in the freezer. And that's again, if you have a freezer. So, I mean, I really appreciate you bringing this up, Idalia, because these are the sorts of conversations that we have in Byte Wellness. These last few weeks, we talked specifically about this nutrition safety tripod based on a survey that our text members completed, where they said that most of them are shopping at supermarkets as opposed to corner stores, for example. And so most of them are not food insecure, not getting food from a food pantry, for example. So it's absolutely important to consider all those factors. Um, I don't think this one conversation can cover them all.
I know, just not to prolong this because I know it's more of an aside, but through the healing membership that we had, and then through the, what was it, the Sad to Soul workshop,
The plant-based.
we talked kind of the plant-based, right, diet workshop that was a month. Adalia, they actually brought that up, And I guess we met every Sunday, and we had a lot of conversations about that. So we started talking about the farmers markets, and especially farmers markets that were available where you could buy food in bulk like that, and it was less expensive. I think people also mentioned things like Pete's Market and
Mm-hmm.
Jewel and other places where you can get certain foods that are lower in pesticides but don't have to be organic, and you can find them on sale. And I think, Dr. You mentioned maybe 3 weeks ago the foods that were actually very low, that were pesticide free, and you showed us that safety data, and you could
Mm-hmm.
really good vegetables, non-organic, inexpensive, that were still pesticide free. So I don't know
Yeah.
how
So
else.
I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because so again, Galia, I don't know if you've heard of the Environmental Working Group, but they put out this recurring list of the highest pesticide residue foods and then the lowest. So, one of the things we talked about a few weeks ago on the text thread and on this workshop is look, there are like at least 15 uh, produce items, plants, fruits, and veggies, where buying the non organic version doesn't necessarily get you more pesticides than the organic version. And they're really, I mean, they're fruits and veggies, right? So they're like high nutrient quality. So there is this sense, there's a thought out there that in order to be healthy, you have to buy organic. But what we've done here is actually pushed back against that. There are some foods where there are higher pesticide residues. Some berries, for example, like strawberries, thin-skinned fruits like apples, uh, where you might, depending on your safety threshold, you might want to get organic for those. But we also talked about how if your choice is between getting enough produce or having to skip out on a few servings of fruit each day in order to buy organic, well then as a physician I might have a conversation with that patient saying, look, depending on your health risk, I think it's going to be much more important for you to eat just more fruits and veggies every day, even if they're not organic, right? And then one more thing to your point. So Miss Bridget mentioned the plant-based course that we ran live in January. And that comes up because you bring up that healthier meat is more expensive. And you're right, there's no getting around that. The meat that is antibiotic free and hormone free is more expensive. But you know what is less expensive than that meat? Beans. So eating a plant-based diet ends up being less expensive than eating a diet that includes meat, honestly. Yeah. I know that probably doesn't, there's no way that could address all of your concerns, but does that kind of give you a jumping off place? Does it give you a sense of how it's not exactly hopeless, right? Like there are places where we can claim agency, um, not in spite of our barriers, but uh, because of our assets.
Right. It's like how do we use the resources that we have to overcome, the barriers in place the best way that we can. There's going to be trade-offs. Not
Yeah.
everything is going to be perfect. It's just I think back to those days when my mom would give me, $5 and I had to make it work, to eat. And it was just kind of like making a salad was not on the top of my list of keeping me full for the day. It was like,
Right.
here's this oatmeal for breakfast, here's these fries and this, piece of cake, a lot of starchy foods to kind of help keep me on with enough energy through the day, you know. And it's like the kids kind of get these poor nutrition habits based on what the home can afford, and then they kind of just grow up with those poor habits into adulthood, and then it manifests into significant health risks like diabetes, cancer, you know, to your point. So it's like, you know, we really need these sorts of workshops to help reorient ourselves with, you know, how do we still manage to eat healthy on a budget, you know, and still be full enough throughout the day to kind of make it not seem like a waste, or you know, something that you can't stick with going forward. I think that's kind of like the kind of double-edged sword that we have to help people navigate through to keep them eating healthily. I think, you know, is a trend right now to eat healthy. You know, mainstream media is making it more of a thing, especially if you want to lose weight and look pretty. But I think in our demographic, African Americans, it's a lot more severe and imperative for us to eat healthy just because of some of the diseases that we're genetically disposed to.
Right. And you know, I mean it that's that's real. You bring up really incredible points that food habits, dietary habits start early. Um, People develop their habits out of necessity and availability. And if we can dive deep with folks, which is why I so appreciate you raising your hand and putting that question out there and helping us reframe this conversation, because we need to make this discussion a practical one. So we need to dive deep and, you know, have conversations like, you know what, beans, like lentils or black beans or red beans, actually end up being, they may be more filling and they are more nutritionally rich, like they can give you even more energy than our classic starchy foods. The starchy foods might make you feel like you've had a big energy burst initially, but the benefit of beans is that they are starchy. They have starch in them, so they give you that big energy boost because starch is just layers of folded sugar. And then they give you protein too, which can help fill you up. It slows the emptying of your stomach. So if you eat, you know, a cup of beans versus a cup, same amount of French fries, you are likely to feel more full for longer with the beans. And if we're talking about keeping kids full, then the beans are going to have, right, the protein that they need to grow. They're going to have other nutrients like magnesium that are really important. Um, but most people aren't going to know that, right? I know that because I went to med school and I spent extra time studying nutrition. And when I've had these conversations with folks face to face in my office or in the hospital, their eyes go so big, like they can't believe it, because it turns out that a giant carton of beans you could also get like enough beans to last you nearly a month for like $5.99. I know because I have tons of these cartons in my pantry right now. Um, but again, it's until you've experienced that, what it's like to just soak beans and prepare them to make dried, right? Because that's much more cost effective than buying the cans of beans. Until you've experienced it or you've seen it done, or someone nudges you in that direction, you wouldn't even think about it. It just doesn't seem like a possibility. But these are some of the foods that I think can solve two problems at once: the cost effectiveness issue and then the nutrition issue. But I thank you so much for bringing that
Absolutely, anytime.
up. Okay, guys, we see, okay, this is why we always go over, right? I'm going to tell you one one more thing about food nutrition, but then I want to respect your time. Um, but again, it's these amazing conversations that keep me coming back and, that make me really thankful for you all as a community. So we're looking at food nutrition labels. We started talking about grass feeding and, how grass-fed animals, just like grass-fed humans, they may have a healthier fat profile than animals that are fed corn, which is kind of their standard. I'm going to skip over cage-free, free-range, or pastured. The way that influences nutrition is really just in terms of the amount of sunlight that animals are able to get. And so the free range and pastured foods, the beef and the poultry and the eggs that they lay, may have higher levels of vitamin D because they've had more sun exposure, but that's not the biggest deal. Really, what we want to talk about, if we're going to eat meat and you're going to get like ground beef or ground turkey, we want to talk about the fat content. So in general, eating ground meat, you're eating a lot of saturated, eating any meat, right? You're getting a lot of saturated fat, and generally beef is on that higher fat level that the American Heart Association recommends against. But what they've said is if you find beef that is anywhere from 95 to 90% lean, meaning that there is only 5 to 10% of it that's fat, then that could actually be part of a heart healthy diet. So if enough of the fat has been removed from the beef, well, then maybe it's not all bad. But keep that 90 to 95% mark in mind. What they actually say is if you're at 95% lean or higher, that's part of a heart healthy diet. If you're at 90% lean, but below 95%, then go ahead and cook it and like pour off the extra fat out of the pan. Don't like eat that or fry something up in it. But to Miss Idalia's point, the leaner meat is traditionally more expensive. In our model here, we're looking at leaner meat in the picture on top, 96% lean, only 4% fat, is more than $1 cheaper per pound than this special grass-fed, hormone-free, antibiotic-free meat. So again, we find ourselves in this conundrum where you have to decide between nutrition and safety, because the thing that has a better nutrient profile, like less saturated fat that clogs vessels, ends up not being hormone free and not being antibiotic free, but it also costs less. So these are just sort of the factors to weigh, right? So to Miss Adalia's point, maybe choosing a non-meat plant protein will end up being the choice that meets safety measures, where it hasn't been exposed to hormones or antibiotics because it was grown from the ground, and it has a good nutrient profile. It doesn't have a ton of, artery clogging saturated fat because it's a plant. It's grown from the ground. And it's generally going to be less expensive than this meat. So just another push for plant heavy eating. All right, guys. Just one more reminder, thinking about that nutrition, safety, price trifecta when you get food. And then really quick, can we go through, can you guys tell me which of these you would choose if you had to choose one and you're in the grocery store? What would you go with?
The $7.99 one.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Mhm.
I actually don't know. Miss Adalia, do you want to go ahead?
I have this conundrum all the time. when I go to the grocery store, because it's like, what is the difference and why is this $1 more? Is it better? But
Right.
honestly, I do prefer my meat to not be super lean, even though I know lean meat is better, if you're trying to have less fat and keep your weight down. It's for me it's a little bit more digestible, but I just find
Okay.
the less lean meats just kind of taste a little better to me.
It
Yes,
does. That
yes.
tastes real good. It does.
Pay an extra
I just
dollar
like
for
I
your
like
meat.
drain the fat out and I'm just like, all right, let's go.
There you go. Might as well. I like that. I like that. I would probably go with the 7.99 too. I don't like the fat profile here, but after reading what I have read about antibiotics and added hormones, I'm scared off enough that I think if I'm going to get meat, which I've cut back on lately, I would pay extra to get the increased safety profile. And I would probably just do like you said, Miss Adalia, and just like pour off the extra fat.
And I mean, you buy one and you get one free, so
I
that's
missed
a
that one.
no-brainer, right?
That's so good. Okay. All right, ladies. Thank you so much for joining. If you have any questions, feel free to, you guys have my email, but you also are all on the text thread. So feel free to just sort of send any follow-ups. And you will continue to get messages about this stuff all throughout the end of the week. And we'll be talking about Black maternal health next week. So stay tuned for that. All right.
Yay. Thank you.
Take care,
Okay.
guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Okay.